Oh, thank you, Joanna, and thank you all for giving up your lunch hour to come and hear me. What I'm going to do today is just a little exercise in Political Science 101, which I hope won't start a stampede to the door. More specifically, my aim today is to resurrect a theoretical model of power relations between ethnic groups and apply that model to the conflict management policies of the Canadian state in its relations with the Aboriginal peoples. The theoretical model that I propose to apply is the control model, as formulated by Ian Lustig in 1979 in a celebrated article in World Politics titled "Stability in Deeply Divided Societies, Consociationalism versus Control." The control model, I'm going to argue, enables us to place Canadian Aboriginal relations in, I think, a clear and helpful comparative and historical context. It also explains why those relations remained relatively stable for long periods, despite periodic efforts to change them. It also explains why ethnic relations with the Aboriginal peoples remained for so long an exception to the Canadian Federation's operative norms for the management of ethnic conflict. And finally, it helps to explain why such a long entrenched system eventually broke down. So let's begin with the history of, briefly, with the history of European settler interaction with the Aboriginal or Indigenous peoples of the territory which eventually became Canada. Well, that interaction is centuries old and exceedingly complex. It's been written about by many writers, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. You could fill a library with works on it. The history has been particularly well written, well studied, and there are expert studies by many other social scientists, including some very valuable government-commissioned research, often gathering dust on the shelves, but nevertheless a treasure trove of very valuable research. By approaching the subject through Lustig's control model, I wouldn't presume to try to add anything new to the library of scholarship that exists. What I'm trying to do is to show the value of a theoretical approach. A little bit of background is necessary. It's essential, I think, to understand that the control model, as formulated by Lustig, ran directly counter to the prevailing model of explaining stability in deeply divided societies. And that model, the prevailing model at the time, was the consociational model that had been formulated almost exactly a decade earlier, in 1969, by Arend Leiphardt, in a seminal article in World Politics, in which he famously defined it as a system of consociational democracy. Elites play a key role according to the consociational model, but so too does the design of political institutions, which should be designed to promote the overarching cooperation of elites drawn from the ethnic groups that are or are potentially in conflict, which in turn favors balanced, mutually agreed outcomes and acts as a safeguard against winner-take-all outcomes that tend to ignite or intensify ethnic conflict. Well, Leiphardt's model is so widely known, so widely applied, and has been so widely debated that it scarcely needs elaboration. But to summarize it very briefly, it is defined by four features. The first is a grand coalition, typically an executive headed by a dual or rotating premiership or presidency. Famous example, the dual premiership of Northern Ireland. First Minister, Deputy First Minister, the rotating presidency of the Council in Switzerland, and so on. Secondly, it requires a mutual veto, requiring parallel consent by each group for legislation affecting each group's vital interest. Thirdly, proportionality in the allocation of political offices and resources, and for segmental autonomy, typically through a federal system, but not always, which guarantees each group's right to run its own internal affairs. Though always controversial, Leipartian consociationalism has become the international community's preferred prescription for post-conflict governance in deeply divided societies. It's favored alike by the United Nations, the United States, the European Union, the African Union, the international actors and mediators of all kinds. Among its notable applications are the peace agreement and interim constitution that ended apartheid in South Africa, the Good Friday Agreement for Northern Ireland, the Taif Accord for Lebanon, the Arusha Accords for Burundi, the Dayton Accords for Bosnia, and I haven't exhausted the list. It's failed and proposed applications are also legion, including the Annan Plan for long-divided Cyprus, where it failed once and is yet again being proposed as the basis for a settlement, as well as highly improbable scenarios for Ukraine and even Syria. By contrast, Lustig's control model has been, I think, neglected. It has enjoyed no currency as a prescription, but nevertheless, I think it remains a remarkably good explanation of certain historical and contemporary cases of interethnic relations where stability was or is maintained despite the absence of consociational power sharing. So both those models provide explanations of stability, but their explanations are fundamentally different. Unlike Leipart's consociational model, Lustig's model focuses on cases where stability is maintained not through power sharing, but through the domination of one group by another. In Lustig's terminology, it is maintained through a system of sustained manipulation of subordinate segments by a superordinate segment. Political science jargon, but I hope it's plain. More specifically, using Lustig's terminology, control involves three mutually reinforcing aspects or components. These are segmentation, meaning the physical separation of one group, its isolation from another. Dependence, meaning the subordinate group must rely for basic goods and services on the superordinate group and is denied access to independent sources of economic support. And finally, cooptation, meaning that the leaders of the subordinate group operate within the superordinate group's universe, accept their values and follow their wishes in return for side payments. Control systems do not require some form of authoritarian rule. As Lustig points out, they are compatible with a wide range of regime types, including regimes that are to some degree democratic and even liberal democracies. Indeed, there are cases where two or more groups have democratically shared power between themselves while maintaining a system of control over another group. So let's look more closely at Lustig's model. I'm sorry my visual aid for this failed in trial, so I'm just going to run through them. These may be known to you if you know Lustig's model. The first one, though, it's worth reminding ourselves, the first fundamental feature of control is that resources are allocated according to the dominant group's interest, as perceived and articulated by its elite, rather than through inter-elite accommodation. Secondly, the linkages between the groups is penetrative. The dominant group extracts what it needs and delivers what it sees fit. Thirdly, following from the second, there's no hard bargaining because the subordinate group really has nothing to bargain with. Fourth, the official regime or state apparatus is not a neutral umpire, but instead acts as the administrative instrument of the superordinate segment or group. Fifth, the existing political order is legitimated by the ideology of the dominant group rather than by reference to the common welfare. Some of you will see there, quite rightly, a sort of echo of Gramsci and cultural hegemony, which fits into this model. And finally, what is the visual metaphor? In power sharing, the visual metaphor is often a balanced scale, symbolizing, a balance in the outcomes of the system. The visual metaphor for control is a puppet on a string, with the superordinate leaders pulling the strings of leaders in the other segment. So keep that in mind, the puppet on a string metaphor. Some historical cases of the control model, again, which Lustig cites, the British and Irish in Ireland during the Anglo-Irish ascendancy, and later Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, whites and blacks in the American South during the Jim Crow era, French and Arabs in colonial Algeria, whites and blacks in South Africa under apartheid. Some contemporary examples, Sinhalese and Tamils in Sri Lanka to this day, and Jews and Arabs in Israel. The latter, I should note, being a case cited by Lustig, who has written extensively on that particular case and expanded the control model in doing so. In all of these cases, the control regimes were or are deeply entrenched and resistant to change. A place where the theoretical fit, I think, is very close is the case of relations between non-Aboriginal Canadians, French and English, and the Aboriginal peoples. The only mention of the Aboriginals in the original Confederation Agreement, named the British North America Act of 1867, is a brief statement placing, quote, Indians and lands reserved for the Indians under federal jurisdiction. So in the exercise of that jurisdiction, Parliament passed into law the Indian Act of 1876, a landmark piece of legislation and a fateful step in Canadian Aboriginal relations. Ostensibly, the Act's purpose was to engineer the assimilation of the Aboriginal peoples. Its actual effect, however, was exactly the opposite. Point by point, the Indian Act put in place a comprehensive blueprint for the segmentation, subordination, and control of the Aboriginal peoples. So let us apply Lustig's 7 variables, if you can keep them in mind, to see how close the empirical fit might be. Take the first one, control of resources. Under the Indian Act, the Canadian federal government assumed complete unfettered responsibility for the allocation of resources in all territories inhabited by the Aboriginal peoples, including the greatest resource of all, which of course was the land. Aboriginal leaders were pressured or manipulated into signing vaguely worded treaties, which were then deemed to constitute complete surrender of their people's territorial rights over vast areas, and which have since become, of course, the subject of interminable litigation. In return, the tribes were to receive food, clothing, blankets, sometimes a bit of cash, and other material benefits as payment for remaining on existing reserves or relocating to new ones, which were almost always on marginal lands that were not coveted by settlers. Thereafter, they would be confined to those reserves, and the result was to turn them into basically, for all practical purposes, wards of the federal state. The second feature of the control model, linkages. Well, linkages between the federal government and the Aboriginals varied considerably, depending on the region. They were particularly different between bands in southern Quebec and Ontario and lands appropriated in the west and north, but all were essentially grossly unequal, penetrative in character, and starkly extractive. That is to say, the federal government, with the support or through the agency of the Department of Indian Affairs and its agents, was able to extract what it wanted. Above all, the land, but also acquiescence, cheap labor where that was needed, and useful information. In return, it delivered only what it deemed fit. Thirdly, no genuine hard bargaining took place at any level. Very much unlike the Canadian Federation, where bargaining between federal and provincial leaders was the way the federal system worked. The great exception was relations with the Aboriginal peoples. Any attempt by Aboriginals to engage in hard bargaining was taken as a challenge to federal authority and suppressed. Fourthly, were there any neutral umpires, any arbitrators who would rule impartially? No. Following the control model too perfectly, I think, the role of agents and representatives of the federal government, including officials in Ottawa of the Department of Indian Affairs, the RCMP, the courts, the military, local reserve administrators, all of them saw their role to be enforcers of the Indian Act rather than to be adjudicators. That was how their job was legally defined, and it was how they understood it. It was to ensure compliance with Canadian law, and the law was the Indian Act. Fifthly, the Canadian superordinate group shared a group-specific ideology that was a self-serving blend of what I call Christian religiosity and possessive individualism, which equated progress with the conversion of savages, quote, in each case, and the material advancement of, quote, white civilization. And there I'm quoting directly from the report of the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs in 1876. The control of the Aboriginal peoples could thus be rationalized as morally unimpeachable and for the Aboriginals' own good, as such regimes often choose to rationalize their activities. Sixthly, what was the political design? Politically, the Indian Act was designed to give ultimate control of Aboriginal affairs to federal officials, but it was also to replace traditional Aboriginal forms of government with Canadian government practices. So traditional chieftainships were summarily abolished and replaced by elected chiefs and band councils. But unlike Canadian officials, they were allowed no fiscal powers. In practice, Indian Department agents had final authority over band affairs, and could remove elected chiefs and councils at any time. The result was to entrench a system of co-optation which worked through a clientele system, with the Indian Department as the sole patron and the elected Aboriginal leaders as their clients. And finally, for a visual metaphor, I don't think we could find a better metaphor than Lustig's image of a puppeteer manipulating the string puppet. Well, the control system proved remarkably long-lasting. The Indian Act was passed 140 years ago, and it's still very much the law, though in much amended form. The legacy of control is very much in evidence. Of that, the 2015 final report of the Commission on Truth and Reconciliation provides abundant evidence. But the control system eventually broke down, leaving in its wake a toxic brew of policy conundrums, grievances, irreconcilable disputes over land and rights, international attention, and national embarrassment. The causes of its breakdown, I would suggest, are the following. And following Lustig, I'm again, in the absence of a visual presentation, there are 7, really. I could have added to the list, but here I think are the 7 main ones. The first change that caused the breakdown in control. First, there was a change in the federal government's response to Aboriginal militancy and refusal to acquiesce. Now, Aboriginals had always, many Aboriginals had always been militant and refused to acquiesce, but they'd got practically nowhere. But I date the change, and again, this is rather arbitrary, and historians might wish to dispute my dating, but I date it from 1961, with the establishment of an Indian Claims Commission. Though the Aboriginals were skeptical, given their unfortunate experiences in the past with similar bodies, but nevertheless, they went doggedly back and made some 300 submissions to the Commission, many of which were thoroughly and exhaustively documented, which was a bit of a change in Aboriginal presentations. To their surprise, and indeed their astonishment, the Commission's proceedings and reports demonstrated, and I quote Olive Dickinson, the foremost historian of Aboriginal history on this, what it demonstrated, according to Olive Dickinson, was an even-handed approach and a willingness to listen to all sides. That was a first. For the first time, a federal body was acting, and was seen to be acting, fairly and impartially, and not as an enforcer of the Indian Act. It was an approach the control regime could not indefinitely withstand. A crack in the wall had opened up, and it could not, after that, be closed again. So that was an important one, the shift that took place in the federal government's response to non-compliance. The second one was this, I would say, was the statutory creation of an independent Aboriginal revenue stream. There's a more or less straight line that leads from the 1961 Indian Claims Commission through various other bodies to the Specific Claims Policy of 2007, which enlarged and enriched the specific claims process. There is now no statutory limit on claims made under the process, which impartially adjudicates claims arising from unfulfilled treaty and other obligations of the federal government. So, with impartial arbitrators in place, the awards have soared. During the 5 years following the 2007 plan, $1.3 billion was paid out in compensation for only a minority of the cases that had been adjudicated in that span. And also, one should add, the federal government has set aside billions and has begun to pay substantial sums to compensate surviving victims of the residential schools. So that was a change. Statutory creation of an independent Aboriginal revenue stream. It cut into dependency. Thirdly, this is a big factor, was the rise of rights discourse in Canadian politics. The Charter elevated rights to a central place in our national discourse. And so, though the 1982 Constitution merely affirmed Aboriginal rights without defining them, once the judiciary became the ultimate guardian and interpreter of rights, it couldn't very well uphold rights like equality rights and throw Aboriginal rights under the bus. So rights began to acquire a standing that they didn't have before. So Aboriginal leaders who were objectors to the constitutional changes in 1982 turned out to be the beneficiaries of them. Some of the rulings have been sweeping. I don't have time to go into them, but I could come back to one of the main ones if anybody is interested. Fourthly, the issue, as so often happens in ethnic conflicts, internationalization has an impact. And Canadian relations with the Aboriginals have become, I think, notably internationalized in recent years. The attention paid to Aboriginal issues by governments, NGOs, and the mass media has increased substantially, in part because those issues are now commonly viewed as being inseparable from environmental issues. And also, of course, there's the 2007 United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which enhance the legitimacy of Aboriginal claims. A fifth factor that led to the breakdown of control was the growth in Aboriginal political capacity. Events such as the Beach Lake and Charlottetown Accord campaigns prompted a realization among Aboriginal leaders that crossed all tribal lines. They realized they needed to develop better political strategies and organizations in order to advance their common causes. The Assembly of First Nations exemplifies the trend, but even local chieftainships increasingly came to be held by well-educated, politically sophisticated leaders, both men and women, who in education, professional attainments, language abilities, and other qualities were at least the equal of their non-Aboriginal counterparts in federal and provincial politics. And emulating the latter, for good or ill, they recruited teams of legal advisors, media specialists, and other experts. Thus fortified, they have now become hard and effective bargainers, and that is a real change. Sixthly, a factor that caused the breakdown was simply real estate, the rise in the value of Aboriginal lands. While Aboriginal peoples are only a small percentage of the population, there are vast areas of Canada where they still constitute the bulk of the population and over which they have never formally ceded sovereignty. While many of those areas were once considered too remote and inaccessible to be economically valuable, some are now known to contain exploitable resources of oil, gas, timber, minerals, water power, or, in many cases, they sit squarely in the path of proposed pipeline routes. So it's become increasingly accepted by government and I think perhaps especially by resource sector corporations that for development projects to proceed in areas where Aboriginal title or exist or where the lands are in dispute, that the Aboriginals must at a bare minimum be included as stakeholders. The courts have ruled, I think, quite conclusively on this, even in lands that are just traditionally occupied and where no treaties exist, as in a recent case in British Columbia. Finally, and it's hard to empirically pinpoint this one, though I think I could, just with reference to the extraordinary roster of Aboriginal writers and artists. But there's been a tremendous revival in Aboriginal cultures, and that has led to what I call their demand for parity of esteem, which is a term I've drawn, as some of you will recognize, straight out of the Good Friday Agreement for Northern Ireland. But I like the phrase because I think it perfectly expresses what Aboriginal leaders now demand. It is a precondition, it is a non-negotiable demand, a precondition for nation-to-nation negotiations and for any genuine process of reconciliation. So all of the court decisions and so on, I think, feed into this. There has been, I think, a resurgence of Aboriginal culture, and not just in popular culture, though that has resurged too, in efforts to preserve Aboriginal languages, Aboriginal dances, customs, religions, but also in high culture. Good heavens, check Amazon if you don't have a surviving bookstore anywhere near. Look at the best-selling authors, like Thomas King. Right, look at the most famous artists, Bill Reid, and so on. The list is extremely long. Some of the foremost in the high culture of Canada today, some of our foremost contributors are Aboriginals. A formidable change from the past, something no one could have dreamt of when Aboriginals were subjects to be civilized in 1876. So, what has happened? The three components of control, segmentation, broken down. Now more than half of Aboriginals don't live on the reserves, and those who do go freely back and forth. So that's broken down. Dependence might seem to be little changed, but it has changed fundamentally. Today's department, which now been renamed the Department of Indigenous and Northern Affairs, it has virtually no fiscal discretion. Everything is tied up by court decisions, by treaties, which are now being fairly adjudicated, and so there's little left in discretionary expenditures. Aboriginals now have entitlements. They can point, and they can also, under the Canadian Human Rights Act, which was extended to Aboriginals in 2008, they can now sue the department for any alleged inadequacies in its financial administration. What a change. And finally, co-optation hasn't entirely disappeared, but it's been stood on its head. Today, among Aboriginal leaders, even the slightest hint of co-optation is to be avoided like the plague. And an unfounded allegation of co-optation can wreck a political career, and has done so, as poor Sean Atleo, former national chief of the Assembly of First Nations, who'd signed an agreement with the federal government in good faith, but he was soon under attack for being co-opted. His career was finished. So that is unfortunate, because co-optation is now a sort of weapon that the critics within the Aboriginal communities use. So essentially, Aboriginal leaders are very sensitive about it because they're vulnerable to outbidders, very much like Northern Ireland, like Bosnia and other places where outbidders play a disproportionate role in negotiations. But still, they haven't entirely stopped matters. I don't think the breakdown of control will lead to a comprehensive, constitutionally entrenched agreement between the federal government and the Aboriginal peoples, at least not anytime soon. There are too many leaders, federally and provincially, who would think it would just open up the Constitution again and open up the unresolved question of Quebec's place in it, so they don't want to go there. So it's not a starter. On the Aboriginal side, there are still political differences stemming from the different tribes and bands who have different histories, locations, resource bases, population sizes and traditions of leadership. It makes it difficult for them to negotiate as one entity. The ASN is a very good umbrella organization, but it's not a level of government, and it has no authority to negotiate on everybody's behalf. And there's no clear consensus in any case among the Aboriginals on how they should be represented or what their goal should be. So to wrap up, the most likely scenario, very Canadian one, more of the same. The federal Aboriginal relationship will continue to evolve piecemeal in fits and starts in response to a combination of unforeseen events and the factors I have previously identified. That may be less than ideal, but I think it's nevertheless no small achievement. So I'll stop there and see if you have any questions. Thank you.